The words hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. "Give me those keys, Margaret, or we'll have to make this decision for you." My son-in-law Derek stood across my dining room table, his hand stretched out like he was demanding candy from a child. Not the keys to my home of 37 years. The Thanksgiving turkey sat cold between us, forgotten, as my entire world shifted in that single moment. I'm Margaret Collins, 72 years old, and until that Thursday evening, I thought I knew my family. I thought I understood love, respect, and what it meant to care for someone. I was wrong about everything. "Mom, Derek's right," my daughter Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She wouldn't look at me directly, just stared at her untouched plate of food. "You can't keep living in this big house alone. What if something happens to you? What if you fall down the stairs and nobody finds you for days?" Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd been practicing them in front of a mirror. My Sarah, my only child, the little girl I'd raised alone after her father died when she was just 12, the same girl who used to run to me whenever she was scared, now sat there telling me I was too old, too weak, too stupid to live in my own home. "This house is too much for you, Margaret," Derek continued, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate over the past 2 years. "The maintenance, the bills, the upkeep. You're 72 years old. You should be relaxing, not worrying about fixing gutters and mowing lawns." I watched him carefully as he spoke. Derek Williams, 34 years old, married to my daughter for 3 years now. Tall, thin, with perfectly styled hair and clothes that always looked expensive. He worked in sales, or so he claimed, though I'd never quite understood what he actually sold. Sarah had met him at some business conference, and 6 months later they were engaged. From the very beginning, something about Derek had bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. Maybe it was the way his eyes moved around my house during their first visit, like he was calculating something. Maybe it was how he always steered conversations toward money, asking about my expenses, my insurance, my plans for the future. "You know what would be perfect for you," Derek said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I found this amazing place just 20 minutes from here." He pulled out a glossy brochure and slid it across the table toward me. "Sunset Manor. It's a beautiful retirement community with everything you could need. Medical staff on site, meals prepared for you, activities with people your own age." I picked up the brochure with trembling hands, though the trembling wasn't from age or weakness. It was from anger, pure and simple. The cover showed smiling elderly people playing cards and doing puzzles, with big letters that read, "Independent living for active seniors. It's only $2,800 a month." Derek continued, as if that was a bargain. "And look at all the amenities. You'd have your own little apartment, but none of the responsibilities of home ownership. $2,800 a month?" I repeated, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. "Well, yes." Sarah jumped in quickly. "But Mom, think about what you're spending now on this house. The mortgage, the utilities, the repairs. It probably adds up to about the same. Maybe more." I almost laughed out loud. Mortgage? I'd paid off this house 15 years ago. Utilities ran me maybe $200 a month, and I did most of the maintenance myself or hired my neighbor's teenage son for lawn work. They had no idea what my actual expenses were, but they were making financial decisions for me anyway. "And the best part," Derek said, leaning forward with what I'm sure he thought was a caring expression, "is that you'd be safe. There's security, medical help if you need it, and most importantly, you wouldn't be isolated anymore." Isolated? That was rich coming from Derek, who never called unless he needed something. Never visited unless Sarah dragged him along, and spent most of his time at my house looking at his phone or finding excuses to leave early. "I'm not isolated," I said quietly. "I have friends, neighbors, My book club. My volunteer work at the library. Mom, be realistic, Sarah said, finally looking up at me. When was the last time any of those friends actually checked on you? When was the last time you went anywhere besides the grocery store? Her questions stung because they contained just enough truth to be effective. I had been living quietly, keeping to myself more than usual. But that was by choice, not because I was incapable or lonely. I'd been watching, listening, learning things about my family that I wished I'd never discovered. Look, Margaret, Derek said, his patience clearly wearing thin. We're not asking you to decide tonight, but we need you to start thinking seriously about this. Sarah and I are worried about you. We care about you. That's why we're having this conversation. Care about me. Right. If Derek cared about me, he wouldn't be sitting in my dining room on Thanksgiving, pressuring me to give up my home, while the turkey I'd spent all day cooking grew cold on the table. What exactly would happen to this house? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Derek and Sarah exchanged a quick glance, and I caught something pass between them. A look of understanding, like they'd discussed this scenario many times before. Well, Derek said carefully, the most practical thing would be to sell it. The real estate market is really good right now, and a house like this, in this neighborhood, would probably sell quickly. And where would that money go? Another glance between them. It would go toward your care, of course, Sarah said quickly. The money from the house would pay for Sunset Manor, and hopefully there would be enough left over to cover any medical expenses you might have as you get older. I nodded slowly, as if I was considering their proposal. Inside, though, I was thinking about something Derek didn't know I knew. 3 weeks ago, I'd seen him standing outside my house with a man in a suit, pointing at my roof, my windows, my front yard. When I'd asked Sarah about it later, she'd claimed she didn't know anything about it. But I'd taken a picture of the man's license plate and had my neighbor's son look it up online. Robert Chen, licensed real estate appraiser. He'd been hired to evaluate my property, and I hadn't authorized any appraisal. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. How much time? Derek, Sarah warned softly. No, it's a fair question, he said, looking directly at me. Margaret, you've been thinking about it for months now. Every time we bring this up, you say you need more time. Meanwhile, you're here alone in this big house, and anything could happen. What do you mean, anything could happen? Derek leaned back in his chair, and for just a second, his mask slipped. I saw something cold in his eyes, something calculating. I mean, you're not getting any younger. Your reflexes aren't what they used to be. Your memory isn't as sharp. Last month, you forgot about our dinner plans twice. The month before that, you left your stove on all night. I did not leave my stove on all night. Sarah told me you did. I turned to look at my daughter, who was staring at her plate again. Sarah, you called me the next morning and mentioned that the house smelled like gas, she said quietly. I remembered that conversation differently. I'd called Sarah to tell her about my neighbor's gas leak, which had caused a smell that drifted into my yard. But somehow, in Sarah's retelling, I'd become the one with the gas problem. The point is, Derek continued, these little incidents are going to keep happening, and they're going to get worse. We're trying to help you make a smart decision while you still can. While I still can. There it was, the real message. The implication that soon I wouldn't be capable of making my own decisions, and then they'd have to make them for me. I looked around my dining room, at the family photos on the walls, at the china cabinet my mother had given me, at the worn wooden table where I'd helped Sarah with her homework every night for years. This wasn't just a house to me. It was my life, my memories, my independence. But as I sat there, Surrounded by Derek's ultimatums disguised as concern and Sarah's guilty silence, I realized something important. For 2 years, ever since Derek had come into our lives, I'd been watching this moment approach. I'd seen the signs, heard the hints, noticed the way they looked at my house, my possessions, my life. I'd been testing them, giving them chances to prove me wrong, hoping my suspicions were just the paranoid thoughts of an aging woman who'd been alone too long. Tonight I had my answer. "All right," I said, standing up slowly from the table. "I'll think about what you've said." Derek smiled for the first time all evening. "That's all we're asking, Margaret. Just think about it seriously." I nodded and began clearing the dinner plates, though none of us had eaten much. As I carried the dishes to the kitchen, I could hear Derek and Sarah whispering behind me, probably congratulating themselves on finally getting through to the stubborn old woman. They had no idea that their test was over, and they had failed completely. For 2 years I'd been watching and waiting. Now I had all the answers I needed. 2 years ago, when Sarah first brought Derek to my house, I knew within 5 minutes that something wasn't right about him. It wasn't anything obvious. He was polite, well-dressed, said all the right things. But there was something in his eyes when he looked around my home. Something that reminded me of my late husband's business associates, who used to evaluate properties for purchase. "What a lovely home, Mrs. Collins," Derek had said, shaking my hand with just a little too much firmness. "Sarah told me you've lived here for decades." 35 years next month," I'd replied, watching as his gaze moved from my antique furniture to my hardwood floors to the large windows overlooking the garden. "Must be quite expensive to maintain a place like this," he'd continued, still looking around rather than at me. "These older homes, they're beautiful, but the upkeep can be overwhelming." That's when I knew. Most people, when meeting their girlfriend's mother for the first time, ask about her health, her interests, her life. Derek was calculating square footage. Over dinner that night, I'd made a decision that would shape the next 2 years of my life. Instead of confronting him directly or warning Sarah about my concerns, I decided to run a test. A long, careful test that would reveal Derek's true character and, unfortunately, show me exactly how much my daughter had changed. I started acting more fragile than I really was. It began with small things. I mentioned having trouble opening jars, even though I opened them just fine when I was alone. I talked about feeling overwhelmed by bills, even though I'd been managing my own finances since before Derek was born. I complained about the house feeling too big, too empty, too much responsibility. Derek took the bait immediately. "You know, Margaret," he'd said during their second visit, "Sarah and I were talking, and we think you might benefit from some help around here. Maybe someone to help with groceries, cleaning, that sort of thing." "Oh, I couldn't afford anything like that," I'd replied, playing the role of the struggling widow perfectly. "Well, what if it didn't cost you anything?" Derek had smiled. "I have connections in the service industry. I bet I could arrange something affordable, maybe even free as a trial program." That was the first lie I documented. Derek didn't have connections in the service industry. What he had was a plan to get me dependent on outside help, to make me feel incapable of living independently. But I played along. When he arranged for a cleaning service to come as a favor to a friend, I accepted gratefully. When he set up grocery delivery through a program for seniors, I thanked him repeatedly. When he suggested I apply for what he called a community grant that would help with my utility bills, I filled out the paperwork he provided. What Derek didn't know was that I was paying for all of these services myself, through a web of arrangements I'd set up with local businesses. The cleaning lady, Maria, was actually my neighbor's daughter-in-law, who needed extra work. The grocery deliveries were from a service I'd used for years. The community grant was money from my own savings account, transferred through my bank in a way that looked like external assistance. Every month I'd get bills that Derek never saw, payments that kept his illusion alive. I was financing my own supposed helplessness. Meanwhile, I was documenting everything. Every condescending comment about my capabilities. Every suggestion about what I should do with my life. Every time he steered conversations toward my finances, my property, my future plans. Sarah, unfortunately, was being manipulated just as carefully as I was. "Mom, Derek thinks you might be developing some memory issues," she'd told me about 6 months after they started dating. "He says you've been repeating stories, forgetting conversations." This was news to me, since my memory was fine. But I realized Derek was feeding Sarah false information, making her believe I was declining mentally. "Have I been repeating myself?" I asked, genuinely curious about what lies he'd told her. "Well, you told Derek the same story about your garden club 3 different times," Sarah said gently. "And last week, you forgot we were supposed to have lunch. Neither of those things had happened. I'd never told Derek any stories about my garden club, and Sarah and I hadn't scheduled any lunch. But Derek was creating a narrative of decline, building evidence in Sarah's mind that I was becoming incompetent. The more I watched him work, the more impressed I became with his manipulation skills. He was good at this, systematic and patient. He never pushed too hard or moved too fast. He let Sarah reach the conclusions he wanted her to reach, making her feel like the concerned daughter who was noticing problems on her own. 6 months into their relationship, Derek started bringing up the subject of my house directly. "This place is really too much for you, isn't it, Margaret?" he'd say during visits. "All these stairs, this big yard to maintain. Wouldn't you be happier somewhere smaller, more manageable?" Sometimes I think about it. I'd agree, playing my part perfectly. "But this house has so many memories." "Of course it does," he'd say sympathetically. "But memories don't have to be tied to a place. You could be just as happy somewhere more appropriate for your stage of life." Stage of life. As if being 72 meant I should be shuffled off to some institutional setting to wait for death. Around this time, I decided I needed professional help with my investigation. I contacted a private detective named James Morrison, a retired police officer who specialized in financial fraud cases. "I need you to look into someone for me," I told him during our first meeting at a coffee shop downtown. "Derek Williams. I want to know everything about his finances, his employment history, his debts." James had been thorough. Within 2 weeks, he presented me with a detailed report that confirmed my worst fears. Derek Williams was broke. Not just struggling financially, but completely underwater. He owed money to credit card companies, banks, payday loan services, and private lenders. His total debt was over $120,000. His income from his sales job barely covered his minimum payments, and he was constantly borrowing from new sources to pay off old ones. More disturbing, James had uncovered evidence that Derek had done this before. His previous girlfriend, an older woman named Patricia Moore, had mysteriously decided to sell her condominium and move into assisted living just months before Derek left her for Sarah. Patricia was now living in a facility that cost most of her life savings, while Derek had moved on to his next target, me. The report also revealed that Derek had been researching legal procedures for obtaining financial power of attorney over elderly relatives. He'd visited websites about conservatorship laws, downloaded forms for declaring someone mentally incompetent, and even consulted with a lawyer about protecting elderly family members from poor financial decisions. Every page of that report made me angrier, but also more determined to see my test through to the end. I needed to know just how far Derek would go, and more importantly, I needed to understand how much of my daughter I'd already lost. to his manipulation. The answer came during what Derek had called a family meeting about my future. "Mom," Sarah had said, sitting across from me in my living room, while Derek took notes on a legal pad. "We've been talking to some experts about elderly care, and they all agree that you're showing signs of needing more support." Experts? What experts? I wanted to ask, but I already knew the answer. Derek's experts were probably websites he'd found online, or maybe that lawyer he'd consulted about conservatorship. What kind of support? I'd asked innocently. "Well, obviously you can't continue living here alone," Derek had jumped in. "It's not safe and it's not practical. We need to start looking at alternatives that would be better for everyone. Better for everyone. Not better for me. Better for everyone. Including Derek, who would benefit from the sale of my house." That night, after they'd left with promises to research options for my care, I'd sat in my kitchen and reviewed everything I'd learned over the past 18 months. Derek was a predator who specifically targeted older women with valuable assets. Sarah was so completely under his influence that she genuinely believed she was helping me by supporting his plans. And I was running out of time to expose the truth before they took legal action to remove my independence entirely. I made 2 phone calls that night. The first was to my lawyer, Richard Patterson, who'd handled my family's legal affairs for over 20 years. "Richard, I need you to prepare some documents for me," I'd said. "It's possible I'll need to reveal information I've kept private for decades." The second call was to James Morrison. "I need you to document everything Derek Williams does from now on," I'd told him. "Every place he goes, everyone he talks to, every piece of paper he files. I have a feeling things are about to move very quickly." I was right. Within weeks, Derek had arranged for that property appraisal I'd discovered. He'd started pressuring Sarah to have more serious conversations about my declining mental state. He'd even gone so far as to suggest that I might need professional intervention soon. The test was nearly over. For almost 2 years, I'd given Derek and Sarah every opportunity to show me that family meant more to them than money, that love was stronger than greed, that my daughter would choose her mother over a manipulative boyfriend. They'd failed every single test, but they had no idea that the vulnerable, confused old woman they'd been manipulating was actually in complete control of the situation. Soon, very soon, it would be time to show them who Margaret Collins really was. The morning after that Thanksgiving dinner, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and made the phone call that would change everything. Richard Patterson answered on the second ring, just like he had for the past 30 years. "Margaret, good morning." His familiar voice brought me comfort I desperately needed. "How are you holding up?" "The test is over, Richard," I said simply. "They failed. All of them." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Richard had been my husband's business partner first, then mine after Edward passed away 8 years ago. He was one of only 3 people who knew the truth about my life, and he'd been waiting for this call ever since I'd started my experiment with Derek and Sarah. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Richard asked carefully. "Once we reveal everything, there's no going back to the quiet life you've built. The quiet life was supposed to protect my family," I replied, staring out my kitchen window at the garden Edward and I had planted together decades ago. "But my family doesn't exist anymore. What I have now is a daughter who's been turned against me, and a son-in-law who sees me as nothing more than a paycheck." Richard sighed. "Tell me what happened." I spent the next 20 minutes describing Derek's ultimatum, Sarah's betrayal, and the months of manipulation that had led to that moment. Richard listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, preparing for what we both knew had to come next. "I'll need the full file," I told him when I finished. "Everything we've documented about Derek. All the financial records, the business portfolio, the foundation documents. Everything. Margaret, are you sure you want to go that far? We could handle this more quietly. Perhaps just cut off the assistance without revealing the full extent of your assets. No, I said firmly. Derek has been planning to have me declared incompetent. Sarah believes I'm a confused old woman who can't take care of herself. They need to understand exactly who they've been trying to manipulate. After I hung up with Richard, I walked through my house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. For 40 years, this place had been my disguise. The modest furniture, the older appliances, the carefully maintained but not luxurious surroundings. Every choice Edward and I had made about how to live had been designed to protect our privacy and our family's safety. The decision to live simply hadn't been about money. It had been about survival. In 1983, Edward's younger brother Michael had been kidnapped outside his office in downtown Chicago. Michael had been flashy with his wealth, drove expensive cars, wore expensive clothes, lived in a mansion that screamed success. The kidnappers had targeted him specifically because his lifestyle made it obvious he could pay a large ransom. We'd paid $3 million to get Michael back safely. But the experience had changed everything about how Edward and I approached our growing business empire. We'd made a pact that night, sitting in this same kitchen while Michael recovered in the hospital. We would never again make our wealth visible to the world. So we'd bought this comfortable but unremarkable house in a nice but not exclusive neighborhood. We'd driven reliable but not luxurious cars. We'd dressed well but not expensively. To everyone around us, including our daughter Sarah, we were successful but not wealthy. Edward worked in business consulting, and I was a homemaker who did volunteer work. The truth was very different. Collins and Patterson Enterprises owned 17 companies across 3 states. We had commercial real estate holdings worth over $40 million. We owned a chain of medical supply companies, 3 restaurant franchises, 2 small manufacturing businesses, and a logistics company that handled shipping for major retailers. Edward and I had built this empire together, starting with a small janitorial service he'd inherited from his father, and growing it systematically over 3 decades. Richard had been our lawyer, then our partner, and finally the day-to-day manager of our holdings after Edward's death. I remained the majority owner and final decision-maker for everything. But to the outside world, I was just Margaret Collins, the quiet widow who lived in the same house for 40 years and volunteered at the library twice a week. Even Sarah didn't know the truth about our family's wealth. We'd planned to tell her when she got married, to set up trusts for her children, to bring her into the family business gradually. But Derek's arrival had changed those plans completely. When Richard arrived at my house that afternoon, he brought 3 thick folders and a laptop computer. "Everything's here," he said, settling into my living room chair. "The financial statements, the property records, the documentation of Derek's background, and most importantly, the record of every bit of assistance you've provided to Derek and Sarah over the past 2 years." I opened the first folder and smiled grimly. James Morrison, my private investigator, had been thorough. Derek's complete financial history was laid out in devastating detail. The debts, the previous girlfriend he'd manipulated, the legal research he'd done about taking control of elderly relatives' assets. But the most damaging evidence was in the second folder, a complete record of every job opportunity, every lucky break, every financial windfall that Derek had experienced since he'd started dating Sarah. The sales position he'd gotten at Morrison Electronics. I owned Morrison Electronics. His supervisor, Tom Morrison, was James Morrison's cousin, and he'd hired Derek at my request. The big commission Derek had earned from the Henderson account 6 months ago. The Hendersons were longtime clients of one of my companies, and I'd specifically directed business to Derek to make him look successful. The contest Derek had won that paid for Sarah's engagement ring? I'd created that contest through our marketing company and made sure Derek's entry would win. Even their apartment lease had my fingerprints on it. When Derek's credit application was rejected, I'd quietly provided a guarantee to the landlord through one of my subsidiary companies. For 2 years, I'd been the invisible hand making Derek's life work, creating opportunities and successes that fed his ego and convinced Sarah he was a good provider. Every dollar he'd earned, every break he'd gotten, every stroke of luck that had kept him afloat financially had come from me. And he'd used that artificial success to build credibility with my daughter, to position himself as the competent one while painting me as increasingly helpless and confused. The beauty of it, Richard said as we reviewed the documents, is that we have records of everything. Bank transfers, employment contracts, competition rules, lease agreements. Derek won't be able to claim any of this was legitimate. The third folder contained something even more powerful: recordings. James was able to install listening devices in Derek's car in his office, Richard explained. Everything he said about you, everything he planned, every conversation with Sarah about your supposed mental decline. It's all here. I listened to just one recording, Derek talking to Sarah after a visit to my house 3 months ago. She's getting worse, babe. Did you see how confused she got when I asked about her bills? And she kept repeating that story about her neighbor's cat. I think we need to start moving faster on the conservatorship thing. Sarah's voice on the recording was heartbreaking. Are you sure, Derek? She seemed fine to me. Trust me, I know the signs. My grandmother went through the same thing. Pretty soon, Margaret won't be able to make rational decisions at all. And then we'll have to step in for her own protection. I turned off the recording. I'd heard enough. There's one more thing, Richard said quietly. The Collins Family Foundation. I nodded. The foundation had been Edward's dream. A way to give back to the community while maintaining our privacy. We'd established it 15 years ago, with an initial endowment of $5 million, and it now had assets worth over $12 million. The foundation provided college scholarships, supported local food banks, and funded programs for elderly people who were victims of financial abuse. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been funding programs to help elderly people avoid exactly what Derek was trying to do to me. What's your timeline? Richard asked. Tomorrow, I said. I want Derek and Sarah to come here tomorrow evening, thinking they're going to pressure me into signing papers for Sunset Manor. Instead, they're going to meet the real Margaret Collins. Richard packed up his folders and stood to leave. Margaret, I have to ask one more time. Are you prepared for how this might affect your relationship with Sarah? Once she knows the truth about Derek, about the money, about everything, she may not be able to forgive herself for what she's done. I walked Richard to the door, considering his question. Sarah was my only child, the most important person in my world. But the Sarah who'd sat silently while Derek demanded my house keys wasn't the daughter I'd raised. That Sarah had been replaced by someone who saw me as a burden, a problem to be managed. Richard, I said finally. I've spent 2 years watching my daughter turn into someone I don't recognize. Tomorrow she's going to find out who I really am. After that, we'll see if there's enough of the real Sarah left to save. As Richard drove away, I stood in my doorway looking at the house that had been my disguise for 4 decades. Tomorrow the performance would be over. Tomorrow Derek Williams would discover that the vulnerable old woman he'd been manipulating was actually one of the most successful businesswomen in the state. Tomorrow Sarah would learn that her mother wasn't the declining elderly person Derek had convinced her to see, but a woman who'd been testing them both and keeping detailed records of their failure. The test was over. Derek and Sarah had failed with distinction. Now came the reckoning. I called Sarah Friday morning, using the trembling voice I'd perfected over 2 years of careful acting. "Honey, could you and Derek come over tonight? I've been thinking about what you said at Thanksgiving, and I think you might be right. Maybe it is time for me to consider moving somewhere safer." I could hear the excitement in Sarah's voice, though she tried to hide it behind concern. "Of course, Mom. That's wonderful that you're being open-minded about this. Derek will be so relieved. I found some papers in your father's old desk," I continued, playing my part perfectly. "Legal documents and things I don't understand. Maybe Derek could help me figure out what they mean before I make any big decisions." "Absolutely," Sarah said quickly. "Derek's very good with paperwork. We'll be there around 7, okay?" After I hung up, I spent the day preparing for the most important performance of my life. Richard arrived at 6:30 with a briefcase full of documents and a laptop computer. "Everything's ready," he said, setting up his materials on my dining room table. "Are you sure you want to do this here, in your home? This is where it started," I replied. "This is where it needs to end." Derek and Sarah arrived precisely at 7. Derek carrying a leather folder that I assumed contained papers for Sunset Manor. They both looked more cheerful than they had in months, probably thinking their long campaign was finally paying off. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said, giving me a quick hug. "You look tired. Have you been sleeping okay?" "Oh, you know how it is at my age," I said with a weak smile. "Some nights are better than others." Derek shook my hand with that patronizing grip he'd perfected. "Margaret, Sarah told me you found some documents you need help with. I'd be happy to take a look." "That's very kind of you, Derek. But first, I'd like you to meet someone." I gestured toward Richard, who'd been standing quietly in the corner. "This is Richard Patterson. He was your father's business partner, Sarah." Sarah looked confused. "Dad had a business partner? I thought he worked alone." Richard stepped forward, extending his hand professionally. "Actually, Sarah, your parents and I worked together for over 30 years. I've been handling your mother's affairs since your father passed away." Derek's expression shifted slightly, and I could see him trying to process this new information. "What kind of affairs?" "Legal matters, financial planning, business operations," Richard replied smoothly. "Your mother has been quite busy, even in retirement." I sat down at my kitchen table, gesturing for Derek and Sarah to join me. "Before we talk about my future living arrangements, I think there are some things you both need to know about my present circumstances." Derek pulled out his folder eagerly. "Of course, Margaret. Full disclosure is always best when making important decisions. I actually brought some preliminary paperwork for Sunset Manor, just so you can see what the process looks like." "How thoughtful," I said, then looked at Richard. "Why don't you start with the employment records?" Richard opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick file. "Certainly. Derek, I believe you work for Morrison Electronics?" Derek straightened up proudly. "That's right. I'm their top salesperson this quarter." "Excellent," Richard said, consulting his papers. "Morrison Electronics is a subsidiary of Collins Industries, which means you actually work for Margaret." The color began draining from Derek's face. "That's impossible. I got that job through a headhunter. James Morrison is the headhunter in question," Richard continued calmly. "He's also our private investigator, and his cousin Tom Morrison is your supervisor. Margaret requested that you be hired specifically." Sarah looked from Richard to me, her confusion evident. "Mom, what is he talking about?" "Collins Industries." Richard pulled out another document. "Derek, do you remember the Henderson account that earned you a $12,000 commission last spring?" Derek nodded mutely. "Henderson Manufacturing has been a client of Collins Industries for 15 years. Margaret personally directed that account to you." "This is crazy," Derek said, his voice rising slightly. "I earned that commission. I worked for it. And the contest you won that paid for Sarah's engagement ring?" Richard continued relentlessly. "That was sponsored by Collins Marketing Solutions, another of Margaret's companies. There were actually no other entrants in that contest." I watched Derek's face as the implications began hitting him. Every success he'd had, every piece of good fortune, every opportunity that had made him feel competent and successful had been manufactured by the woman he'd been trying to manipulate, Sarah. I said gently, "Your father and I owned 17 companies when he died. I still own them. Collins and Patterson Enterprises has assets worth approximately $42 million. Sarah's mouth fell open. $42 million? Your apartment lease," Richard continued, "was guaranteed by Collins Property Management after Derek's credit application was rejected. The cleaning service, the grocery delivery, even the utility assistance Derek arranged for your mother, all paid for by Margaret herself through various subsidiary accounts." Derek stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "This is some kind of joke. You're trying to confuse us with fake documents." Richard pulled out his laptop and opened it on the table. "These are bank records, Derek. Real-time access to Margaret's accounts. Would you like to see the transfers that have been keeping your financial life afloat for the past 2 years?" The laptop screen showed a series of transactions, each one corresponding to a lucky break or unexpected opportunity that Derek had experienced. The dates matched perfectly with his memories of success. 2 years ago, I said quietly. "When you first came into our lives, I suspected your motives weren't entirely pure. So I decided to test you." "Test me?" Derek's voice cracked. "I created every opportunity you've had. I made sure you succeeded at everything you tried. I gave you the means to feel confident and successful. And then I watched to see what kind of man you really were." Sarah was staring at the laptop screen, watching the numbers that represented her entire lifestyle for the past 2 years. "Mom, why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think you were struggling?" "Because I needed to know who you really were too, sweetheart," I replied sadly. "I needed to know if my daughter would choose to protect and love her mother, or if she would choose to support a man who wanted to steal from her." Derek began pacing around the kitchen, running his hands through his hair. "This is insane. You've been manipulating us this whole time. I've been testing you," I corrected. "And you failed completely." Richard pulled out another folder. "Derek, we also know about Patricia Moore, your previous girlfriend, the elderly woman whose condominium you convinced her to sell before you left her for Sarah." Derek went completely white. "How did you—" "We know about your research into conservatorship laws, your consultations with lawyers about declaring elderly people incompetent, your plans to have Margaret removed from her home." Richard's voice was clinical, professional. "We have recordings of your conversations with Sarah about Margaret's supposed mental decline." "Recordings?" Sarah whispered. Richard pressed a button on his laptop, and Derek's voice filled the kitchen. "She's getting worse, babe. Did you see how confused she got when I asked about her bills? I think we need to start moving faster on the conservatorship thing." Sarah's face crumpled as she heard her own voice responding. "Are you sure, Derek? She seemed fine to me." "Trust me, I know the signs. Pretty soon Margaret won't be able to make rational decisions at all. And then we'll have to step in for her own protection." I reached across the table and turned off the recording. "For 2 years, Derek, you've been telling my daughter that I was losing my mind, that I couldn't take care of myself, that I needed to be managed like a child." Derek slumped back into his chair, the fight going out of him completely. "I was trying to help. The house is too big. You're getting older. You were trying to steal my home to pay your debts." I interrupted. $123,000 in credit cards, personal loans, and other obligations. You're 3 months behind on your car payment and 2 months behind on your rent. despite the fact that I've been subsidizing your entire life. Sarah turned to look at Derek with horror. Is that true? Are we really that broke? Derek couldn't meet her eyes. Richard pulled out one final document. As of this afternoon, all financial support for Derek Williams has been permanently terminated. The lease guarantee has been withdrawn, the employment arrangement has been cancelled, and all subsidiary assistance has been stopped. You can't do that, Derek said desperately. I have contracts, employment agreements, all of which were contingent on performance standards that you've clearly failed to meet. Richard replied smoothly. Manipulating and threatening your employer's family members is grounds for immediate termination. I stood up slowly, feeling decades of careful performance falling away like old clothes. Derek, you spent 2 years trying to convince my daughter that I was a confused old woman who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. You researched legal ways to steal my independence and my home. You manipulated my child into believing that her mother was becoming incompetent. Derek looked around the room desperately, as if searching for an escape route. Margaret, please, there has to be some way to work this out. I made mistakes, but I genuinely care about Sarah. I love her. You love what she represented, I replied coldly. Access to me, to my house, to what you thought was my vulnerability, but you never bothered to find out who I really am. Sarah was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her face. Mom, I'm so sorry. I believed him. I actually thought you were getting confused and needed our help. The saddest part, I said, looking at my daughter with more pain than anger, is that if Derek had been honest from the beginning, if he'd simply asked for help instead of trying to manipulate and steal, I would have helped you both. I would have set you up with jobs, with a house, with whatever you needed. Derek's shoulders sagged as the full magnitude of his mistake hit him. He'd spent 2 years scheming to steal from a woman who would have given him everything he needed if he'd simply been honest and respectful. Instead, I continued, you chose to see me as prey. You decided that I was weak and foolish and ripe for exploitation. You turned my daughter against me and made plans to strip me of my independence and my home. I walked to the front door and held it open. You have 30 days to find new employment and housing arrangements. After that, you're on your own. Derek stood slowly, his face a mask of defeat and disbelief. He'd walked into my house thinking he was about to complete a 2-year con against a helpless old woman. Instead, he'd discovered that the helpless old woman was actually a successful businesswoman who'd been playing chess while he was playing checkers. As Derek walked past me toward the door, he stopped and looked back. You planned all of this, didn't you? From the very beginning. I gave you every chance to be a decent person, I replied. You chose otherwise. After Derek left, Sarah and I sat in my living room in silence for a long time. Finally, she spoke. Mom, how do we fix this? I looked at my daughter, seeing glimpses of the little girl I'd raised, the young woman I'd been so proud of. That depends, I said quietly, on whether you want to fix it. The phone started ringing at 6:30 the next morning. Sarah's panicked voice cut through my peaceful Saturday breakfast. Mom, they're evicting us. The landlord says our lease guarantee was cancelled and we have 7 days to pay 3 months of back rent or get out. I sipped my coffee calmly, watching the sunrise through my kitchen window. How much do you owe? $6,000. Mom, Derek says this is all a misunderstanding, that his boss can't just fire him without cause. He's going to fight this. Sarah, Derek doesn't have a boss. He had a favor that I was doing for him, and that favor has ended. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute. Then Sarah's voice came back, smaller and more frightened than I'd heard since she was a child. What are we going to do? That depends entirely on what you choose to do about Derek. Another long pause. Mom, I can't just abandon my husband because he made some mistakes. Mistakes? I set down my coffee cup harder than necessary. Sarah, Derek spent 2 years planning to steal my home and have me declared mentally incompetent. Those weren't mistakes. They were crimes. Over the next few days, I watched Derek's carefully constructed world fall apart piece by piece. Without my invisible support system, the house of cards collapsed completely. Morrison Electronics terminated his employment on Monday morning. By Tuesday, his car had been repossessed. By Wednesday, Sarah called to tell me they were staying in a motel because they couldn't come up with the money to stop the eviction. Derek keeps saying this is temporary, Sarah told me during one of our daily phone calls. He says he has leads on new jobs, that he can fix this. What Derek actually had were increasingly desperate schemes to get back in my good graces. First came the apology letters, long, rambling emails about how sorry he was, how he'd been under financial stress, how he'd only wanted what was best for me. Richard's advice was to save everything, but not respond. When the letters didn't work, Derek tried visiting my house. I watched from my living room window as he stood on my porch for 20 minutes, ringing the doorbell and calling my name. I didn't answer, and eventually he gave up. Then came the threats. Margaret, you need to understand that what you're doing is elder abuse, Derek said in a voicemail he left Thursday evening. You're using your money to manipulate and control your own daughter. There are laws against this kind of behavior. I played the message for Richard, who laughed grimly. He's accusing you of the exact thing he was trying to do to you. The irony is incredible. Friday brought a different kind of call. Sarah's voice was shaky and exhausted. Mom, Derek's been lying to me about everything. I found papers in his car, legal documents about conservatorship proceedings. He was actually planning to have you declared incompetent. I know, sweetheart. And there's something else. Sarah's voice broke. I called Patricia Moore, his ex-girlfriend. She told me what he did to her. Mom, he's done this before. Everything he did to you, he did to her first. That conversation lasted 2 hours. Sarah told me about finding Derek's research into my finances, his consultations with lawyers, his detailed plans for taking control of my assets. She described discovering his massive debts, his history of targeting older women, his systematic manipulation of her perceptions about my mental state. I feel so stupid, Sarah cried. How could I not see what he was doing? Because he's very good at manipulation, I replied gently. And because he told you what you wanted to hear about being a caring daughter. Saturday morning brought the phone call I'd been expecting. Mrs. Collins, this is Derek. I need to speak with you privately. We have nothing to discuss, Derek. Actually, we do. See, I've been thinking about this situation and I realized something important. You may have money, but I have your daughter. And I have information about your business dealings that could be very interesting to the IRS. The threat was clumsy but clear. Derek was trying to blackmail me. Derek, I said calmly, I'm going to give you some free advice. Threatening to make false reports to federal agencies is a felony. My business records are completely legal and have been audited multiple times. But extortion attempts are taken very seriously by law enforcement. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Derek's voice came back, angrier and more desperate. You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you can just destroy people's lives because you have money. But Sarah's my wife, and those kids we're planning to have will be my children. You'll never see them if you keep this up. What children, Derek? You can't afford the children you don't have. I hung up and immediately called Richard. I think it's time for a restraining order. But Derek wasn't finished. Sunday evening, Sarah called in tears. Mom, Derek's been drinking. He's saying crazy things about getting back at you. About making you pay for ruining his life. I'm scared. Where are you now? Still at the motel, but Derek left hours ago and he's not answering his phone. I made a decision that surprised even me. Pack your things and come here. Tonight. Mom, I can't just leave Derek. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. Derek is a dangerous man who's been backed into a corner. He's already threatened me, and now he's drinking and talking about revenge. You need to get away from him right now. An hour later, Sarah stood on my doorstep with 2 suitcases and red-rimmed eyes. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past week. I'm sorry, she said as I let her in. I'm sorry for everything. We'll talk about apologies later, I replied, hugging her tightly. Right now, let's focus on keeping you safe. Monday morning brought news that Derek's desperation had reached new levels. James Morrison called to report that Derek had been arrested Sunday night for attempting to break into my neighbor's house, apparently thinking it was mine, in his drunken state. He's in jail on burglary charges, James told me. But more importantly, his arrest made the local newspaper. The story mentions his employment termination and the restraining order. Word is getting around about what he tried to do. By Tuesday, Derek's attempted manipulation of me had become the talk of our small community. The story had grown in the telling, becoming more dramatic with each retelling. Some versions had Derek trying to steal my house while I was in the hospital. Others claimed he'd been forging legal documents. The truth was bad enough, but Derek's reputation was destroyed completely. Sarah told me that his former co-workers were avoiding him. His friends had stopped returning his calls, and even his own family was embarrassed by the scandal. Wednesday brought a call from Tom Morrison, Derek's former supervisor. Mrs. Collins, I want you to know that Derek called here yesterday, demanding his job back. He claimed you were blackmailing me into firing him. I had to explain to him that I've known about his employment arrangement all along, and that his behavior toward you made continuing that arrangement impossible. Derek's isolation was becoming complete. The community he'd been trying to impress with his supposed success now saw him as a predator who'd targeted a vulnerable elderly woman. The fact that I'd turned out to be far from vulnerable only made his behavior look more pathetic. Thursday evening, Sarah and I were having dinner when Derek appeared at my front door again. This time, he wasn't alone. He'd brought Patricia Moore, his previous victim. Margaret! Patricia called through the door. Derek told me what happened between you two. I wanted to warn you about what he's capable of. I opened the door to find a woman in her 60s, well-dressed but tired-looking, standing next to Derek, who appeared haggard and desperate. He's been calling me for days, Patricia continued, asking me to convince you to give him another chance. But I wanted you to know the truth about what he did to me. Derek's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. Patricia, you don't understand the situation here. I understand perfectly, Patricia replied sharply. You tried to do to Mrs. Collins exactly what you did to me. The only difference is that she was smart enough to see through you. For the next 20 minutes, Patricia told Sarah and me the complete story of Derek's previous con. How he'd convinced her that her condominium was too expensive to maintain. How he'd isolated her from friends and family. How he'd eventually pressured her into selling her home and moving into an overpriced assisted living facility. I lost everything, Patricia concluded. My home, my independence, my savings. Derek took it all and then disappeared the moment the money ran out. Derek stood on my porch, listening to his previous victim expose his methods to his current victim's family. His shoulders sagged with each damning detail. When Patricia finished, I looked Derek directly in the eye. This is who you really are. Not the charming man who swept my daughter off her feet. Not the caring son-in-law who worried about my safety. You're a predator who targets older women because you think we're easy victims. Derek's mask finally slipped completely. You people don't understand anything. I'm not a predator. I'm a survivor. Do you know what it's like to be drowning in debt? To have bill collectors calling every day. To watch other people live comfortable lives while you struggle for every dollar. Yes, I replied quietly. I do know what that's like. My husband and I started with nothing and built everything we have through hard work and smart decisions. But we never considered stealing from vulnerable people as a solution to our problems. Derek turned and walked away without another word. Patricia watched him go, then looked at me with something like admiration. You're very lucky, she said. Not many of us get the chance to turn the tables on someone like Derek. After Patricia left, Sarah and I sat in my living room processing everything we'd learned. Mom, Sarah said finally, what's going to happen now? I looked at my daughter, seeing both the woman she'd become and the little girl she'd once been. Now we rebuild, I said. But first, I have one more surprise that I think Derek deserves. 2 years have passed since that Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything. And I'm sitting in my new office at the Collins Family Foundation, looking at a letter that arrived this morning. It's from Derek, his first attempt at contact since Sarah divorced him 18 months ago. Dear Mrs. Collins, it begins. I know I have no right to ask for your help, but I'm writing to let you know that I'm trying to rebuild my life. I've completed a program for people with gambling addictions, and I'm working as a night janitor at a hotel downtown. I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did to you, and to Sarah, and I'm sorry. I set the letter aside and look around my office. The walls are covered with thank you notes from elderly people who've been helped by our expanded elder protection program. Photos of families who've been reunited after financial abuse cases. Certificates recognizing the Foundation's work in preventing elder fraud. This office represents the most meaningful work I've ever done. After Derek's attempted manipulation became public, I realized how many other older adults were facing similar threats from family members, caregivers, or romantic partners. The Collins Family Foundation, which had operated quietly for 15 years, became the centerpiece of a much larger mission. Mom, the Channel 7 news crew is here for your interview. Sarah calls from the reception area. My daughter works as the Foundation's program coordinator now, having discovered a passion for helping others that Derek's manipulation had nearly destroyed. The interview is about our latest program, a workshop series that teaches older adults how to recognize and resist financial manipulation. We've trained over 300 people in the past year, and several have successfully protected themselves from scams that might have cost them their homes or life savings. Mrs. Collins, the reporter asks as cameras roll, what inspired you to expand your foundation's work in this area? I smile, thinking about how to answer honestly, without revealing too much personal information. I learned from experience that financial predators often target older adults because they assume we're naive or helpless. But experience and wisdom can be powerful weapons against manipulation if we know how to use them. After the interview, Sarah and I drive to her new apartment across town. She'd moved out of my house 6 months ago, not because of any conflict between us, but because she needed to prove to herself that she could live independently again. Grammy! 8-year-old Emma runs to greet me as we enter Sarah's cozy 2-bedroom place. Behind her comes 6-year-old Michael, both of them the children Sarah had with her new partner, David, whom she'd met in the divorce support group I'd helped her find. How are my favorite people in the world? I ask, scooping both children into a hug. David emerges from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He's a teacher, patient and kind. Everything that Derek wasn't. More importantly, he knows the complete truth about our family's wealth, and has never once suggested that it should change how we live or what we do. Margaret, I saw the news interview online, David says. The Foundation's work is really making a difference. We're just getting started, I reply. Next month, we're launching a legal assistance program for elderly people who've been financially abused. Richard is helping us set up partnerships with law firms that specialize in elder law. Sarah brings out photo albums showing the children's recent activities. Emma's ballet recital, Michael's baseball game, family trips to the zoo and museums. Normal family moments that feel precious after everything we've been through. Have you heard anything from Derek lately? Sarah asks quietly while the children play in the living room. I show her his letter. Sarah reads it carefully, then hands it back without comment. What do you think? I ask. I think Derek is probably sincere about being sorry, Sarah says slowly. But I also think he's hoping you'll feel guilty enough to help him financially. My daughter has learned to see manipulation clearly, a skill that serves her well in her work with elderly abuse victims. She's also learned that forgiveness doesn't require putting yourself back in danger. The kids ask about him sometimes, Sarah continues. I tell them their father is trying to get better, but that we can't see him right now, because he made some bad choices. This is the most painful part of Derek's legacy. Emma and Michael barely remember him, but they're growing up knowing they have a father who isn't part of their lives. Sarah and I have decided that when they're older, we'll tell them the truth about what Derek did. But for now, they just know that Daddy had problems he needed to work on. I've set up college funds for both of them. I tell Sarah. Full scholarships, plus money for housing and expenses. But the funds are structured so that Derek can never access them, even if something happens to you. Sarah nods gratefully. She's learned that protecting her children sometimes means protecting them from their own father. That evening, after dinner and stories and bedtime routines, Sarah and I sit on her small balcony overlooking the city. It's peaceful here, quiet in a way that my house never was during those 2 years of Derek's manipulation. Do you ever regret how you handled everything? Sarah asks. Sometimes I wonder if there might have been a gentler way. I consider her question carefully. I regret that it was necessary at all. I regret that Derek chose manipulation over honesty. And I regret that you had to learn such a painful lesson about the person you'd married. But I don't regret protecting myself, or protecting our family's assets, or exposing Derek's true character. What about the foundation work? Do you think you would have gotten involved in elder abuse prevention if Derek hadn't tried to manipulate you? Probably not. I admit, I might have continued living quietly, keeping my wealth private, focusing on small-scale philanthropy. Derek's attempt to victimize me opened my eyes to how many other older adults face similar threats. Over the past 2 years, our foundation has helped more than 50 families dealing with financial elder abuse. We've provided legal assistance, temporary housing, counseling services, and education programs. We've also worked with law enforcement to prosecute several cases of elder fraud. The most rewarding case involved a 78-year-old man whose adult son had been stealing from his bank accounts for months. Using techniques we developed, we helped document the theft and recover most of the stolen money. The son faced criminal charges, but more importantly, the father learned how to protect himself from future manipulation. I got another letter this week, I tell Sarah, from Patricia Moore. She's thinking about moving back to a regular apartment instead of assisted living. Patricia has become something of a friend over the past 2 years. She volunteers with our foundation now, helping other victims of financial abuse understand that they're not alone and that recovery is possible. That's wonderful, Sarah says. It must feel good to know that your experience with Derek led to helping so many other people. It does. But mostly it feels good to know that I can trust my instincts again, and that you've learned to trust yours. As we sit in comfortable silence, I think about Derek's letter again. The truth is, I probably will help him eventually, but not in the way he's hoping. The foundation is developing a program for people who've committed financial crimes against elderly family members. Counseling, job training, addiction treatment. but with strict accountability measures. Derek will never be welcome back in our family, and he'll never have access to our resources in the way he once schemed to obtain. But if he's genuinely committed to changing, he might benefit from programs designed to help people like him understand and address the attitudes that lead to elder abuse. Mom, Sarah says suddenly, I want you to know something. These past 2 years, watching you turn Derek's manipulation into something positive, seeing how you've helped so many other families. I'm proud to be your daughter. I reach over and squeeze her hand. And I'm proud of the woman you've become. Derek tried to turn you against me, but in the end, he just made both of us stronger. The next morning, I'm back in my office, reviewing applications for our newest program. Small business loans for older adults who want to start second careers. It's another way of challenging the assumption that reaching a certain age means becoming helpless or irrelevant. My phone rings, and Richard's voice brings news that doesn't surprise me. Derek Williams filed for bankruptcy last week. He reports, complete financial collapse. He's also facing additional fraud charges related to some credit card schemes he was running. And Patricia's case. The civil suit was settled. She'll recover about 60% of what Derek stole from her. It's not everything, but it's enough for her to regain some independence. After I hang up, I draft a response to Derek's letter. Not the financial assistance he's hoping for, but information about counseling programs and job training resources. Help that requires him to take responsibility for his actions, rather than looking for another easy target. As I finish writing, I realize that Derek inadvertently gave me the greatest gift of my later years, a sense of purpose that goes beyond protecting my own family's wealth. He showed me that the skills Edward and I developed in business, the resources we accumulated through decades of work, could be used to protect other families from predators like him. Every older adult who learns to recognize manipulation tactics, every family that avoids financial abuse, every victim who recovers their independence represents Derek's failure transformed into something positive. I seal the letter and add it to my outgoing mail, then turn back to the applications on my desk. 74 years old, and I've never been busier or more fulfilled. Derek thought he was hunting a helpless old woman. Instead, he awakened a force for justice that will continue protecting elderly people long after I'm gone. Sometimes the best revenge is refusing to be a victim at all.